que acende a sua vontade de começar algo? Tem uma faísca em você que te chama para empreender, investir, dar novos rumos para sua vida. E para todos os seus começos, você pode contar com Santander Select. Um banco mais pessoal, mais próximo, mais humano. Um time de especialistas com olhar atento para cada momento da sua vida. Porque você sabe, só quem já deu muitos passos está pronto para continuar começando. Santander Select. Começa em você, começa agora.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm Jay Carson, sitting in for your usual host, Mike Baranowski. And sitting in for me is Justin Holmes, political scientist. And you know Justin, we've been on the show before. So today we've got it's been a big week and a crazy week. And as we're doing this show, it's Saturday morning, the 13th. And you may, by the time you hear this, new stuff may have happened. But let's start off with Justin. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, thanks. And yeah, I shudder to think, the shelf life on anything political at this point. By the time we hit save, it may be out of date. But...
When Mike and I started this show, we sort of figured we would be doing bigger policy discussions that would take, weeks, months to develop. And that was, 6-8 years ago. No, more than that.
Well, that's quaint.
Yeah. And since then, events have overtaken what our original plan was, but that's off in the way. So anyway, but let's get rolling. Our first story, obviously, is that President Joe Biden forcefully and defiantly has vowed that he's going to stay in the race. First, in an interview with George Stephanopoulos last week, and then more recently at the press conference following the NATO summit. This come amidst numerous calls for his to step aside and in favor of another candidate, calls from office holders, and now from funders and personalities such as George Clooney. I can remember, Justin, when I ran for state representative and George Clooney pulled his support. And, when you've lost George Clooney, you've lost America. These calls to step aside are some subtle, some not so subtle, some outright, we need a new candidate. Others, such as Nancy Pelosi, saying the president needs to make a decision soon. As the president is shouting that he's still running no matter what. Right. And the response, and I think other senators have been sort of more circumspect of, yes, he needs to make a decision, implying that there maybe he needs to make a different decision. What happens from here, of course, is if Biden were to be replaced, is the obvious question of who, and the second, how. There are a number of legal, political, logistical hurdles to doing that. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So first, I'll turn it over to you, Justin, to get your thought on where we are as of Saturday morning.
July
13th.
We could fill the hour with this. I'll try not to, but I've got thoughts.
We do, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is one of those monumental kind of stories, in a lot of ways. Something that certainly in my lifetime we haven't really experienced. So yeah, I liked your phrasing of this, where the notion of the president needs to make a decision. It probably means he needs to decide something else, because he has been pretty emphatic here that he's staying in. And I think where he's sitting, there are a lot of questions. Why is he so emphatic about staying in? What should he do? What's good for the party? Et cetera. And I don't think there's a clear right answer for what the party should do here. We can talk polling in a minute. It's murky at best. But I think there are kind of, in terms of does he need to go? Just speaking in electoral terms, and maybe we can talk governance terms later. There's a lot of ambiguity here, to be entirely honest. So as we all know, the sort of precipitating event here is his real bad debate performance. But historically speaking, debates don't move the needle all that much. And kind of the polling seems to indicate that. There was sort of an immediate fall off in the kind of first part of the week after the debate. And, there have been a couple polls here that basically show the race unchanged. NPR had a poll yesterday, and the headline was basically presidential race unchanged. So, if I were Biden, the signal, at least from the public, is not clear enough. I can see where he might want to stay in. The signal is not clear enough, to my mind, necessarily, if I were running, that, hey, I need to get out. But I do think he's got some pretty giant problems here that might still, sort of necessitate that. And the big issue here, I think, is the sudden loss of the party and really kind of the turn in electoral coverage, which I think have potential downstream effects for him. Not that press coverage needs to be fawning, and certainly, this is, a competence of a candidate is worth reporting on. But it's suddenly become sort of the entirety of the campaign coverage. This has become the story. And I think the concern, for a lot of Democrats is this notion that this is just going to get worse as we go forward, as you get kind of this steady stream of bad press coverage. And, even a good candidate is going to make mistakes sometimes, and they're all going to be framed in terms of, oh, he's, got dementia or what have you. I'm not a doctor. I can't say one way or the other, if that's the case, as a medical fact, but certainly that's what the coverage is going to look like. And so I think that's really a big hurdle. Looking back at the week, there were a couple of pretty negative Trump stories that largely got sort of buried because, the entire discussion now is Biden. So I think maybe I'll kick that over to you for a second, and maybe we can kind of separate out the candidates and process stuff and come back to that in a minute.
Yeah. So, first, I would disagree that it's just he had a bad debate performance. It's not a matter of, is he good at that particular event? I think what happened is, there have been, for years now, particularly in the conservative media, have been, and for those who have eyes to see, that listen, this is not the Joe Biden of 2010. It's not the Joe Biden of 2015. It's not even necessarily the Joe Biden of 2020. And the phrase "lost his fastball," which was sort of what they was floated in 2020, that would seem to be an understatement. And this is is not a thing of gee, can our candidate do well in debate? It's a matter of, does he have the bottom line cognitive functioning ability? And for conservatives, I'll tell you, there's a little bit of Schadenfreude, but also a lot of Freude, but also some rage, right? There that listen, 3 weeks ago, conservatives, let's say, I don't know, conservative media outlets, conservative leaning media outlets, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, others were pointing out, his seeming to freeze at the fundraiser with George Clooney and President Obama, his seeming to wander off at the D-Day celebrations, and on other things, and were accused of these videos, which were unaltered videos, of being cheap fakes and all this sort of stuff. That was 3 weeks ago. And we were told, no, the president runs circles around his, the younger aides are trying to keep up with him. And well, then we come back after this, the media sort of suddenly becomes interested in the situation. And we hear the stories about, well, yes, he did a week of debate prep, and would start around 11 and take a break for naps. And look, he's really on fire between 10 and 4. And so forth. And I think it's just a matter of, there were a lot of folks out there who've been saying this for years and have been pilloried, derided. Where does Robert Hur go to get his apology? That sort of thing. So I think that's what this is not just a look, he flubbed a little bit, he had a bad night. and the subsequent rehab attempts on with Stephanopoulos and with the NATO press conference, I think it's almost good news, bad news in that neither of those went great, but neither of them went so poorly, right? There was like everyone says no, he has to go. He's got just enough juice to sort of hang on. And I think that's a problem that Democrats are having. There was almost like, look, if he went out at this NATO conference and crashed and burned, that then yes, it would be a much more settled question. And then there's some who think that maybe that was even the intent with some people of let him go do it and crash and burn.
Yeah, no, and I think that's fair. And I think is kind of the point I was trying to make. There's enough ambiguity here, that it makes it hard to know exactly what to do. And I agree with you on the kind of subsequent public things. They don't tip the needle one way or the other. Essentially, they're okay. And I mean, if he wants to assuage people's fears, they need to be knock it out of the park, which it's clearly not.
No, but again, the sort of the headline is sort of like, president not entirely senile. That's still not, that's still not what you're shooting for, right?
Right. I mean, it's damning with faint praise.
Yeah.
So, sure.
And I think that is like, look, if you had put let's say the debate hadn't happened and we were just looking at the NATO press conference, would people be saying, and again, you don't have to say, wow, this is Winston Churchill, right?
Right.
But it's a matter of, is this someone I feel comfortable, does he inspire at least a minimal degree of confidence that he knows that he is in charge of what's going on. And look, I think that's fundamental, but I'm rambling.
No, that makes sense. And and I think I don't want to dismiss the debate, and I think there are legit concerns. I mean, I'm not gonna put that down. And I know you guys had been talking about this, well before this happened, as well. You and Mike, I think, had addressed this, a couple months ago. So, but I do think the debate is kind of that tipping point.
Yeah. Well, it's because everybody saw it.
But the other thing I would add to that, though, I think the big issue is kind of the what happens with the coverage, and from your perspective, perhaps it's the rest of the media coming around to the truth, and maybe that's the case, but there were a few polls kind of in the immediate aftermath of the debate before kind of this drumbeat of you've got to dump the president, where it really didn't drop any. I mean, the people that saw the debate, I mean, yeah, it was largely, hey, that was pretty bad, but it didn't really do anything. And then you start getting these polls after you get, the Ezra Klein piece and, this kind of drumbeat, et cetera, where then you do see this drop. And, so I think that is the pivot point. I mean, I think the NATO summit and such this week would have largely been, he's all right, but we wouldn't be having this conversation if it was just that, so anyhow.
So I guess I'm interested in your, as a person of the left or of the center left, or at least left of me, what's your thought as far as one, the best way to go, one, substantively, right? Or let me back this up. Let me ask it this way instead. Your way to go, the best person from a procedural / electability standpoint, and then sort of a question on substantively, right? Where do you think the party ought to go?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add, as a person of, I don't even know exactly where I fit, as far as center left, super left. I don't know, but I hate
to just label someone a person of the left without their consent. I think them's fighting words in some places. So
heck, I'll own it. I'm kind of all over the place on certain things. Anyway, but I'm also somebody that studies and teaches about campaigns and elections. So I'm going to try to keep that hat on for the most part here. So procedurally, this is just a mess. One of the issues is, and I've been correcting people on Facebook about this, which is a terrible way to spend my summer vacation. But, everything is, what can the DNC do? What should the DNC do, et cetera? And, the problem that we have with that, and this is a moment where this is coming back to bite us perhaps, is that, the national parties, particularly in presidential politics, are tremendously weak as institutions at this point.
Yeah, I would agree.
And, especially for presidential politics, this really gets its start kind of in the 90s with Clinton, where you've got, this rise. Actually, to take it further back, I mean, the beginning of this erosion is when we switched to the binding primary process in 1972, when the convention stopped meaning anything and so on.
See, this is the kind of deep thought analysis kind of stuff that we're after. So this is good stuff.
So we're going back to now before I was born, but that's the beginning of kind of the decline of the parties. But up through kind of the 90s, up through the 80s anyway, they commanded enough resources that they still really kind of matter. The problem that you've got now, and Clinton was kind of the first to really sort of bring in outside consultants and kind of professionalize that campaign, and Karl Rove represents that on the Republican side and such. But basically, there's nothing in the party that has much sway, and there's some evidence out there that during the primary process, party insiders and party elites, essentially through endorsements, are still able to exert some influence. By and large, the folks that get the most endorsements seem to get the nomination, Trump notwithstanding in 2016, but beyond that, it generally works. The problem is, there's no leverage once you get to somebody being the presumptive nominee.
The presidential campaign controls the party, not the other way around.
Exactly. Yeah. And then kind of affiliated political action committees can control the funding and, things like that. So, basically, I think Democrats, probably should have had this conversation, if we could, get the DeLorean up to 88 and go back and fix this stuff. This was a conversation for 3 years ago, in a lot of ways. As far as, bringing it to now, I mean, what you can do essentially is sort of Hector the president, or, he's still the president. Hector him until he decides that, look, the writing's on the wall, I've got to go. And that could yet happen. If we look, I mean, that George Clooney thing is potentially a fatal blow. And but I think,
which I'll just remark is odd in itself. But,
this is like the last time you and I talked.
Who's in charge here? Well, George Clooney.
Thinking of all those episodes of ER that I watched, him being Kingmaker is just bizarre. But we're through the looking glass at this point. So, but I think where that erosion of various people, and I think the bigger issues are kind of erosion of partisan support within the Democratic Party, as well as the funders, that really make these campaigns go. You're starting to get, I mean, we're up to what, 9 or 10 House Democrats have explicitly said he needs to go, one senator, a bunch of candidates, actually 2 of Iowa's 4 Democratic House candidates have said he should go. There are others in other states. I think they're, especially the 2 are in pretty swingy districts.
And when those tend to be, and I thought about, geez, should I list all these folks? But in most cases, you wouldn't have heard of most of them.
Right.
Because they are sort of backbenchers in swing districts. And this is, I think, for them coming out and saying he should go is, what Mike and I call is sort of, it's the safe vote, right?
Right.
There's no way you can lose that, because if he is and everything goes south, well, you can say, I told you so. So, yeah, I think those folks sort of have not much to lose. And that's sort of the very safe position for them to take.
I think, I mean, when, if Pelosi had said something more definitive, or, if Hakeem Jeffries were to come out, against him or something, that's a bigger thing.
But they're getting closer to that, I think, with the.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think, they're, so a lot of stuff I've read up to now is largely, it's all deep off the record kinds of things where, you have people, saying, and staffers are saying this is a problem, and members of Congress are saying this is a problem. None of them on record. And I think maybe as you have a few more, even if they're backbenchers, I mean, that could be sort of, the start of a tidal wave of problems, for Biden. The other thing, I just read a thing this morning, actually, that he apparently had a pretty contentious meeting with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus yesterday, which had been a group that was pretty stalwart behind him. And so, again, if you start losing there, Biden, whatever his faculties might be, I mean, the guy's been in Washington approximately forever. And I think, he might get the message eventually if the entire party bails on him. The other thing that popped up yesterday, there was a New York Times article that, some group of donors was going to withhold $90 million, if he, doesn't go. And so that becomes, the
I think the line that I read was something from James Carville, who is saying that the donor class is in open revolt, is what he said.
Right.
So,
and again, that's a huge problem. And I could rant for an hour and a half about money in politics, and I won't do that. But it's the reality of the situation. Is that I mean, we're looking at billion-dollar campaigns at this point, and if you can't come up with that money, you're just out of luck. So, and
I'd say it's a huge problem in a regular race, right?
Sure.
Or in let's put it this way, a typical race where you've got an incumbent who would typically have a incumbency advantage, but when you're starting from sort of a razor thin margin, right? Both in sort of national polls,
right,
popular vote polls, and then a couple swing states, and then you throw in the razor thin margin in the House. That's this becomes much more. It's a game of inches type thing, and that really does matter.
Yeah, and now taking off the political scientist hat and putting on my leftist whatever persuasion hat, this couldn't have happened at a worse time. Coming from the perspective that, hey, I'd like to see a Democrat win and whatnot. This is just the absolute worst case scenario, in so many ways. Because, I mean, we are, and we've been in this dynamic for a while where, it's just these razor thin margins. I mean, it's a closely divided country, and, there's no room to screw this up. And I guess maybe that might let me pivot here to talk candidates for a second. I think part of my skepticism here, or a little bit, and that's not saying I'm not a giant Joe Biden fan in a lot of ways before this, but
I was going to say you're not alone.
Yeah, well, I didn't caucus for him, and I will say we know, if you go to the Iowa caucuses, you know exactly where everybody stands because they stand.
See him standing there,
and there was no enthusiasm. I mean, he came in 5th in my precinct, I think, and the people that were behind him weren't very excited about him. So, I'm not a fan. I mean, I'm largely approaching this from an approach of, what's a winning hand. And, the problem here, is that on short order like this, coming up with a viable alternative, and again, I'm talking just electoral stuff here, setting aside questions of governance and whatnot.
Just the pure logistics of it.
The pure logistics of it. I mean, I think the only really viable candidate is probably Harris, who's not fantastic. The other names, I think there are people that, again, if we'd had this conversation 3 years ago, I think there are some other people that could be in the mix that I think could be really strong candidates. Gretchen Whitmer in particular, somebody that's a Democrat that can win a purple state. I think that's got some merit, as candidate. I think, Mayor Pete, has I think, a potential career in front of him, but he's a little green. But ultimately, you look at these folks and, they don't have the national name recognition. They don't have the organizational support behind them. They haven't been running. They just don't have that spark. I actually, J.B. Pritzker, in a lot of ways, I like, as I'm from Illinois originally, and he's fixed a lot of what's wrong with Illinois, after a series of governors in jail. And, I think in terms of competence, he'd be pretty good. But, a chubby billionaire from Illinois, I don't know that plays particularly well, on the national stage. All of which is to say that, Harris is about all that's left. And, I think she's got some advantages, just logistically speaking, where you could, it's the Biden-Harris campaign, and heck, you just move her name up the sign and it becomes the Harris somebody else campaign. Sorry, you were going to.
No, I just got a while we were talking, Mike just texted us. And it's nothing important. I originally thought it was like, what the hell are you guys doing? This sucks. But no, he just said to send him this stuff later. I would say I agree with you on both counts on Harris being one, the easiest. And I also agree with you on her not being well liked. But I mean, I think to the extent we can explain it, and I will say that, because I get this question a lot of, how does this work with the money, the campaign funds and the delegates and all that? And I think my answer, and we did this in some of the Slack group the other day, is look, I think there's always a way to get it done. There may be a bunch of rules you have to change or break or sort of turn a blind eye to.
Sure.
But I think that can still get done. I mean, if you move the money, who's really going to object? Well, Republicans will yell and scream about it. And
do what?
Exactly. I don't know that anyone particularly has standing to sue.
The other thing,
unless it would be Biden, I don't see Merrick Garland weighing in to criticize improper campaign use or the FEC. But as I understand it, there's a bunch of different funds here, right? I mean, there's this 150 million more or less that's sitting in this account that is essentially, like, I guess the best way to describe it is kind of like a joint checking account, right?
Right.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that they're both on it. So if Biden becomes the nominee and then steps aside and Harris moves in, she already can sign checks on that account, right? I think so. I think that makes it easy. Other PAC money moving from Biden to another candidate is more difficult. But again, I think doable. That said, all of these are hurdles, and I think they're minor hurdles. I think they're hurdles you get over.
Yeah.
But still, if it's a close race and you've got one candidate that has to jump over a bunch of hurdles and the other that doesn't, that can make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think
just in terms of time, energy, and realizing how late in the game it is, because going back to the logistical piece. I mean, so many, when you plan on a presidential campaign, this is something that you do years in advance, and you have advanced polling years in advance, and you break position statements, and you have people on the ground, and you've lined up all your local folks, from your governors down to your state ward leaders and all of these things.
Right. I mean, speaking as an Iowan, I mean, we know, you can look 4 years in advance and see who's sniffing around, and sometimes 8 years in advance who's sniffing around, in terms of that. So, there's a long tail on these things.
Yeah. And the other difficult thing is it's one thing if you have, say, an open seat, open primary that you're running for. It's quite another to be challenging an incumbent, and in challenging an incumbent who has essentially already received the nomination at this point.
Right. I mean,
you sort of you have to walk this very thin line of not looking disloyal, not looking as if you are too interested in this. And I think usually the way these things would play out, right? If I'm the campaign manager, if I'm orchestrating this, and in the past I've done some of this kind of stuff on the state or local level, is say like a Gretchen Whitmer, what you do is you have a bunch of wise old gray heads from the party, write a letter saying, listen, we need you, and please will you consider running, and draft Gretchen and all this sort of thing. But even that takes time, and I don't think they have the time.
I mean, this has got to be settled in the next 2 weeks. Yeah. Jinx. But yeah, so I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, the time factor. The other thing that just sort of occurred to me, if you are somebody who is younger and ambitious, do you even want to touch this?
Exactly. No, I think, Justin, this is why I like you so much.
Shucks.
You think like practically kind of Machiavellianly and where Mike sometimes does not, but yes.
If you are,
there's absolutely the reason to let the whole thing implode and blow up and say, "Hey, not my fault. I had nothing to do with it."
Not my fault. But I mean, how many, Trump notwithstanding, well, I guess Biden notwithstanding. I mean, how many times did he run? But you don't get so many shots at this, and to spend it on one that is going to be a goat rodeo of some sort, or has a higher.
So if I'm Pete Buttigieg,
I'm going to bite that apple in 4 years.
Off into the woods somewhere, right?
Right, exactly. So, and so I think again, Harris. I mean, this is her shot. I don't know that she. So I think on a on a logistical and in terms of wanting it, in terms of being prepped, sort of thing. I mean, I think she's about the only option. And I've said, I think in conversations with you in the past, I mean, the Democrats have a bench problem. Anyhow. I do think they have some potential young talent here, but boy, this isn't the moment to deploy it. And the story,
right? It's like calling up Thumman from AAA and putting him to start in the World Series. Right.
Yes. So yeah, I think she's for all of those reasons she's it. The challenge then becomes, I mean, as you astutely pointed out, the margins here are razor thin. And now taking off putting my political scientist hat back on, this is where polling doesn't tell us much. There is enough slop built into polling that when you need to deal with margins like this in terms of making decisions, you're just out of luck.
Yeah.
And, I mean, at a minimum, if everything else is being done right, which again, I could give you an hour-long rant about, challenges to doing polling in 2024. But assuming everything's done right, you've got a plus or minus 3 margin on every poll in a series of choices that is like a 2-point contest. And, the polls have been all over the place with Harris. I mean, in some of them, she outperforms Biden, and some of them Biden outperforms her. And so, again, I think there's just in terms of what to do, I was talking with somebody on Facebook the other day. I said, I'm just, my main thing at this point is I'm just really skeptical of anybody that says I have the right answer, right now.
I think that's,
because there's not. I mean, I feel like the word unprecedented gets used wrong a lot lately, but this is truly unprecedented. Well, Trump always uses it as, unfair, I think, is his version of this. This is the original meaning of unprecedented, where, and I, for so much of the last, 6 years, I've been saying that, absolutely nothing in 25 years of political science has prepared me for anything that's happening anymore. And that's kind of where we're at. But
I feel the same way. Yeah. And again, my education, goes back even to further than yours. This was. I mean, there are some, and I guess that's what I'm always trying to do, and Mike's trying to do, and I think you're trying to do too, is to look for those perennial principles that still hold even in these weird times.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's if anybody, none of them are listening, but I have a question on my campaigns and elections final about how much of this is consistent with things that we know that work over elections, and how much is idiosyncratic. And I think that's an ongoing thing, and now we're just totally in the weeds. At this point down the.
And I guess maybe the closest thing that I could compare this to is Johnson's decision not to seek re-election in '68. But even that sort of pales because, one, it was Johnson's decision.
Right.
There may have been people inside talking to him saying, "Look, we don't think the polls look great." But it was emphatically his decision, and also he made it well ahead of in plenty of time for there to be a primary process.
Right. And actually, other historical, a slightly newer one, and one that maybe is what gives me so much trepidation. I was in grad school in Minnesota when Paul Wellstone died, which that's a slightly different situation because he didn't have any say in the matter, as far as that goes. But just in terms of, God, I mean, that was a 6-week window, I want to say, give or take. Just it really brings home sort of the logistical nightmares of replacing a candidate, and that was one where.
Well, and on that, and then we can probably move on because
it's probably time
because we could talk about this for like several shows, I think.
Oh, I think so.
But a lot of Democrats have floated this idea of well, we'll do this and we'll have a mini primary, and I will ask you as a Democrat and as a political science.
Yeah.
How the hell does that even work? I don't know that there is such a thing. Like, who gets to vote in the mini primary? I'm pretty sure most people don't. I think it's probably donors and superdelegates or something, right?
Yeah, this gets to that point where I have to remember that probably I should refrain from using the F word on a podcast. But somebody floated that a couple weeks last week that feels like forever ago. And I remember replying, another political scientist had posted that, about the mini primary or something. And I just said, this is the dumbest idea I've heard ever, and that might, ever's a long time, but it's a terrible idea. I think, I think where we're in agreement is this got to be done now, and that drags it out. Regardless of which way it goes, it's got to get settled. I mean, you have to get back to campaigning, and whether that's Biden staying or whether it's kicking it over to Harris, neither of which I think is a fantastic option, to be blunt. I mean, this is a rock and a hard place kind of situation, but you have to do one and commit to it. Whatever it is, you need to commit. My sense is probably at this point, just with how much chaos is around this, whether it's earned or not earned and whatnot, probably replacing is better. I mean, I think that this is, should Biden go becomes a 4-month-long story.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about this, first week in November. I mean, I feel like that might be the best way to move on, but
also, I mean, if you're Kamala Harris, and again, I'm not, I God knows I can't get into her head, but yeah, I mean, is there a sense of, wow, hey, congratulations, you're the nominee, but you're totally set up to fail,
right?
And what does that say? And and the other piece that I think that comes back to haunt Democrats a little bit. Now, I think you shore this up with the base. I think probably doesn't care. But I think independents do is the theme for the Biden campaign had been, it's, democracy's on the ballot and so forth. And yet you're coming into a situation where your candidate is necessarily, assuming it's not Biden, is necessarily going to be undemocratically selected.
Not a good look.
That's just sort of, yeah. Well, and that's, it was sort of the same argument, Republicans made back with Hillary Clinton, right? With the super delegates and all that kind of stuff. And
ultimately, the super delegates didn't matter.
The way the Democratic Party structures itself is sort of more inherently less democratic than the way the Republicans do, for good or bad, right?
Although, to be fair, the Republicans have, at least used to have, procedure for completely setting aside the primaries and picking somebody else. That lasted all of 30 seconds in 2016, but there was a motion to do that with Trump. So, and that gets back to, what institutional powers does the party have? But anyway.
And for the record, just because you and I haven't talked about this before, but for the record, I mean, I think I've said, a party can pick its own nominee however it wants. The fact that we've chosen popular primaries to do this, I think is probably a good way to do it, right? To vet people. But there's nothing in the Constitution that would require a political party to have a, this particular primary, process to choose their nominee.
Oh, yeah. In much the same way that James Madison couldn't have comprehended a dishwasher, he couldn't really comprehend this process either.
And also point out that, listen, I mean, Lincoln was chosen in a smoke-filled room. You know what I mean? So it's.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I am generally supportive of the primary process. I like small d democracy stuff that gives people.
And I think it does result in the tends to result, not always, but in the better, more electable candidate.
I think so, yeah, and builds enthusiasm, and it's a test of can this person campaign and whatnot. But then you get into these off situations like this where then the party doesn't have a lot of levers to pull.
One more question, and this might be an unfair question.
Awesome.
And I'm asking. I hate this because a lot of people ask me I speak for all Republicans, which I don't. I like I'm just some guy on nothing better to do on Saturday morning. But you as a Democratic voter, do you feel at all let down, betrayed? Those are kind of loaded terms, but by the fact that this information wasn't available and you didn't have the opportunity to have a more robust primary in which the party may have chosen someone else.
I think with hindsight, maybe, and I will say, where my Machiavellianism may have failed me, in the past, I had, when people were talking about, maybe somebody else should run against Biden, in the primaries, I had kind of some of those same bench concerns a little bit. Ultimately, I think for most Democrats, this is,
and in fairness, he's an incumbent president, and that is almost always the presumptive nominee. So
you don't want to shiv somebody like Teddy Kennedy did Carter. And speaking of somebody with one term of eligibility left, Jimmy Carter's still out there. But I do think, hindsight being what it is, there was not a lot of enthusiasm for Biden. So going back to my caucus story, from 20 minutes ago now, the whole kind of raison d'etre of Biden, the whole case for supporting him was that he could win. It was largely about beating Trump.
He's the guy who beat Trump before. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the 2020 case for him. It was not that anybody was really excited for a Biden presidency. It was that, it was really that, hey, this is the guy that can win. And I think that's, some of his problem now is that, I don't know that he's cultivated, any kind of thing like that.
Yeah.
But I think the sensible thing, knowing what we know now, and even, there was some talk that, hey, he'd just be a 4-year caretaker, there
was more than some talk. He essentially said that. He said, I'm going to be a bridge to the next generation.
Because I'm going to be 900 years old the next time we do this. So
a very long and shaky bridge.
That one in Temple of Doom, I think. But anyhow, So I think ultimately, that's where this should have been settled. Is that he probably should have been a one-termer, and but it's hard, with an incumbent and he wants to stay. Somebody, I forget who it was, but somebody pointed out the other day that Joe Biden's been running for president for 50 years, and he'll be damned if he's going to give it up. At this point. And so
I told my kids the other day that Joe Biden ran for president my senior year in high school.
Oh, geez.
And they were sort of stunned and flabbergasted that yes, this is not only.
Indeed. All right. Should we?
So we should keep moving on though. Yeah, important other world events.
Okay, so as we're thinking about elections, as odd as it is after the last conversation that we had, there is another candidate in this race, in fact, and a convention coming up on the Republican side in Milwaukee in very short order. And so there's been a lot of attention here about who Trump's potential vice presidential pick is going to be. Oddly enough, Mike Pence is not in the mix this time. But beyond that, Trump's been pretty tight-lipped about, who this might be.
Although he says he knows who it is.
He knows who it is, but he's not so, yeah.
Never the showman, yes.
But he's not showing his hand too much. So, from what I'm seeing, and this is where, hey, well, you can put the Republican hat on, the three leading candidates at this point seem to be Marco Rubio, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, and J.D. Vance. What do you think about these? Is this kind of the universe of folks? Do you think anybody has, I don't expect you to be a Trump mind reader, but, does any of these have an inside track? would any of them have advantages as far as, supplementing something on the ticket?
Yeah. I think the list might be a little bit broader, but I don't know, right? I mean,
this is the names that I keep seeing.
Tim Scott. We've heard Glenn Youngkin.
That's one I hadn't heard, actually. That's interesting.
Yeah, I just heard that this morning, that supposedly he's, but again, it's this could all be speculation, right? And if you are,
Right.
It's pretty easy to do this. I mean, if we wanted to, maybe we should have done this as an experiment. I think we totally should have just floated the rumor that I'm being considered as a vice presidential possibility and see how far it gets, right? Because I do think in a lot of these kind of things, somebody says, "Hey, I hear he's thinking about this guy," and it, it gets enough legs to get reported, and whether it means anything at all, is debatable. So that said, of the three you mentioned, Rubio, Vance, and who was the third? Burgum. Yeah. Oh my God. I was having a Biden moment.
Oh,
see, but they're
also
the
great indicator
of
his chances if we can't come up with his name in short order. Check out his spelling.
Well, his chances, though, it doesn't so much whether people can remember his name. It's can Trump remember his name, right? for this portion of the game. I like Doug Burgum, whose name I couldn't remember a minute ago, for a number of reasons, and I think Trump would like him too. And to me, at first, I thought, who the hell is this guy? Why would I care? But he's got this sort of plains Western, Midwestern sensibility about him that Trump doesn't, right? And that's weird talking about that, but I think he does have this resonate probably with rural folks. And it's got a bit of that, cowboy, so to speak, right? That Trump's a city slicker, Burgum is not. The other thing that Burgum's point on the ticket is that he does bring energy production, make that an issue, and I think that resonates with a lot of people. And I think Burgum doesn't do anything to hurt Trump, right? And so I do think he's good. J.D. Vance, and this is something that is perplexing. And the other thing about Burgum is he was out early for Trump. So he, that's not an electoral thing, but that's a Trump thing. So
that's a very Trump thing. I mean, to hear these other two in the mix a little bit is
J.D. Vance, who is critical of Trump for several years. I don't know that J.D. Vance brings much to the ticket at all. And I'm still a little perplexed by that, other than, he's been sort of beating the drum sort of against Ukraine aid and so forth, and very much jumped into line Trump wise pretty quickly.
If I can pull something from your playbook from 15 minutes ago, I'm going to put you on the spot for all Republicans here, but I see a lot of JD Vance on social media, but that doesn't, X, formerly known as Twitter, is not real life. What is his standing with sort of rank and file Republicans? I mean, I know Democrats, we don't.
So
it's kind of weaselly.
Here's the thing, and this is, I'm speaking as an Ohioan, but there was someone on a national broadcast that sort of reminded me of it. J.D. Vance came fairly close to losing his Senate race here. He's a first-term senator. I never run for anything for, wrote the book, which I like the book, but he underperformed Governor Mike DeWine by something to the tune of like 13 or, some points. He underperformed former senator, the Senator Rob Portman, whose seat he was taking, again by something in the neighborhood of 15 some points. So what I'm saying is he had a hard time winning Ohio, and it was really sort of in doubt up until the last moment. We had a big infusion of cash from Mitch McConnell, of all people. Not necessarily because I think Mitch was a fan of J.D. Vance, but because Mitch was a fan of trying to keep control of the Senate. And so I don't get the J.D. Vance pick, what that really brings nationally, other than he is sort of this, he styled himself in this vociferous sort of America first sort of guy. Does he pick up any of the, your so-called sort of hillbilly votes? He's more populist than the other candidates. I don't know, but again, I don't see the appeal. And the other thing also, and this is going to, he's awfully young and awfully inexperienced. He's been in the Senate all of about a year and a half. So I think that's something as well. Now look, you can say he's a best-selling author and he's military service and he's worked in government before and and I'm not saying he's a bad guy or anything, but I just don't see what he brings. Marco Rubio, who was someone I really liked in 2016, I think he's good. I'd rather see Tim Scott, right, as sort of the banner carrier for like what I call the hope, growth, and opportunity wing of the party, right? That was always the story that, the son of immigrants and small business and worked his way up and all that stuff. And so to me, and this is on the personal, my romantic attachments, as opposed to the Machiavellian ones. I like Rubio because he does kind of represent that, I guess what used to be sort of the Jack Kemp wing of the party. That's it. Rubio's done some stuff that I think it was sort of boneheaded, and I'm not crazy about. And I don't know that he's, like I said, I sort of like Tim Scott better, or I wish we could have like a Jack Kemp kind of figure, but we don't, and he might be the closest to it. The other thing
you're telling me about wishing for candidates at this point.
The other thing that I think is a little bit of a problem, and again, this is one of those. It's not a prohibitive problem, but it's one of those speed bumps, right? Is that he's little Marco, and it's gonna. I think he sort of, is Trump going to still call him that on the campaign trail?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but was he not the one that they got into the fight about at the debate about hand size as a proxy for other things?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. There's going to be a lot of
which actually might be a lower moment than the Biden debate, honestly. But anyway,
there's going to be a lot of stuff to throw out there, right?
There's some bad blood there, yeah.
Well, and not even necessarily if there is bad blood, because maybe they've made up and they're buddies now or something like that.
Sure.
But still, the media impression, if he's named the nominee, the story isn't, wow, a first generation Cuban American is vice presidential nominee. It's like former Trump antagonist Rubio is this, and it's rolling all the tapes of that debate and
I can see
little Marcos and all that kind of
50
stuff.
bullet point list of every time that these guys
and it's just sort of so you want to have this big triumphant rollout and it's gonna get scotched kind of by the media, right? And if you're smart, that. And I mean, I suppose there's maybe a way to do that rollout where you can sort of downplay that or deal with it, preemptively. But I think that tends to be the story, right? It's not, hey, hope, growth, and opportunity. Here's this, guy, future of the party, and all that. It's like, look what these jackasses were saying about each other a couple of years ago.
Right. Right.
So, or I mean, there could be still, from what I hear, every Democrat says the vice presidential candidate they fear most would be Nikki Haley. Now, again, I don't see that happening. But
especially with how long she stayed in, that seems like But
in my view, it would almost be easier maybe to do bring on a Nikki Haley than it would be a Marco Rubio. I don't know.
Yeah,
it would be. Here's the thing: it would be babbling too much, but it would be the tougher sell. She would look more reluctant, right? But you would say, yes, for the good of the country, I will do this. And I've had my disagreements with President Trump, and I hope I can, lend my voice to steering him away from his more baser instincts and whatever you want to say.
Right.
But I think, we need to have this voice in the Republican Party, yada, yada, yada. That might, I think that might work. The other interesting thing, and we were maybe going to talk a little bit on the bonus show, but I'll throw it in now, is Trump's done some interesting things in terms of, we mentioned the party not being really controlled, the presidency candidate not being controlled by the party, but vice versa, with the Republican platform, which has a much more toned down abortion stance than it ever has before. Right. And again, this is Trump's doing. This is not the party's doing. So I think that's interesting. And if you look at where Biden probably still does well and what their best issue is still probably abortion.
Oh, for sure.
Nikki Haley, I think, helps on that front.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's going to happen. So
fair enough. And that was something I was thinking as I'm looking at this, and I think you're more familiar with these people than I am in a lot of ways, but thinking about what they bring to the ticket, I do feel like the abortion thing could go either way, and thinking back to poor Mike Pence, I think one area that Trump has had trouble in the past a little bit, or where Pence was brought in, was some skepticism among religious conservative voters.
Yeah.
That was kind of the Pence story. And there has been, some discussion here a little bit with, some of those folks being pretty disappointed in the Trump platform, essentially on abortion, which, I think you're threading a needle there in some ways. When we think about campaigns, and we often talk about swing voters and things like that, and, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at where Democrats have succeeded in the last couple of years, Dobbs was kind of a gift to them, electorally at least, because it gets, kind of suburban women swing voters, fired up. You're seeing places be competitive that wouldn't be in the past, around that. I think the other concern, though, it's not that they're going to go anywhere else, but, is Trump softening his language there? Does that honk off, the base? Not that they're going to vote for Biden or Harris.
Do they stay home? But I don't think it does, because I think a lot of those voters vote defensively more than offensively. Now they're voting maybe offensive to some, but what I'm saying is I think it's not a matter of, well, look, they would love to elect a pro-life, a very strong pro-life candidate,
national abortion ban kind of candidate.
Yeah. But they're more scared of, in what in this case would be, a Biden national abortion rights statement or something. And I think
and a couple Supreme Court justices.
Most of the folks in the pro-life camp hopefully are coming to the realization that, look, this ought to be a state by state battle, right? That's what we always wanted, and that's what Dobbs said. And I think from an outsider's perspective, I think there are kind of two different versions of that, though. I mean, I think there are people that say, yeah, this should be a state's, it's a federalism thing, et cetera. But I mean, there have been people pushing for a national ban, as well. That's not a, and I think that strikes me as and one of those we'll talk in the thing. Is Project 2025, and
that's not a nationally viable political strategy.
Exactly.
Regardless of how you feel. Here's something that polls at 15%. Is kind of so.
But damn it, it's ideologically pure to some extent.
Right.
Unless you're like me and into the whole federalism thing, and let people sort it out. But
it's been fun watching, Minnesota conservatives, it should be a lift to the states, but not like that.
But not those states.
Right. So that's an interesting perspective, because I think, there is this kind of coalition maintenance balanced with, broad appeal and whatnot. So, I don't know, if anybody has a clear line up. One thing I wanted to ask you about a little bit, and this gets into the weeds a little bit. Actually, I'm going to say one thing about Rubio and then put a question to you. I think one interesting thing about Rubio potentially is, by being Latino, he might blunt some criticism of Trump's immigration policy, because certainly not saying, what he feels in his heart, but certainly a lot of the criticism of that is, hey, this is just racist, So to have a Latino on the ticket, I think potentially blunts some of that. I don't know that it does with Latino voters, because I think people often lump them all together, and Cubans are the outliers there.
I was going to say, I'm not entirely, and I mean no offense to anyone I'll probably generate it, but I don't know that Cuban American voters count as Latino voters.
Well, to Latinos, And God, I saw a paper years ago, and I don't know if it ever got published, but somebody actually did a really deep dive on public opinion data, like with all of the Latino groups. And, Cubans are the obvious outliers, but there were surprising differences between like Nicaraguans and Mexicans and things as far as political behavior. And, in polls, there's never enough to really differentiate. But, I don't think, the bulk of American Latinos necessarily want him. But I do wonder if, there might be some white moderates who, that would kind of blunt that perspective, from them, if that doesn't.
Oh, maybe. I don't think significantly, though, right?
It's a small, we're also looking at a 2-point raise, So.
And I think, that those white moderates, I don't think they would look at, he's brought in someone with a Latino or Latinx, if you prefer, last name, but what's he doing on the border? I think most of those moderate swing voters aren't susceptible to the strong immigration policy is necessarily racist, right? I just don't think that's where those voters are. I think those voters are firmly in the Democratic camp anyway, and you're not moving them. So Rubio doesn't do anything there.
Yeah.
Does he maybe give cover to the white suburban women or something like that?
That's where I was thinking, is the because but anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's still like, well, Cuban doesn't count as Latino. So, I mean, he may
never underestimate the average
Mexican's
inability to find countries on a map.
The same question of, say, Ohio Senate candidate Bernie Moreno this year. I think the response is, it doesn't particularly matter that, what his heritage is, because he's not necessarily in the coalition of the oppressed, or at least the right oppressed people. And I will share one story, and this I don't know if this will be offensive to people. It shouldn't be. I worked with a Ohio politician who was running in a new district, and it was a district that had a large number of Latino voters, which we do have in Ohio, and that you might surprise people. But so this was his first time running the district, and I was asking about that, and we had some folks who he might be, working with to help him make inroads to those communities. And he said, well, here's the problem. He's like, it's out there. You have a lot of Mexicans and you have a lot of Puerto Ricans, and the Mexicans apparently think they're all better than the Puerto Ricans. And for all I know, they may be right. So no offense, obviously meant to Puerto Ricans or Mexicans, but I think that's something that is worth pointing out, that the Latino vote is not monolithic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And different groups, different ethnicities care about things differently and vote differently. And Cuban Americans being the biggest exception, but not the only exception.
Right. I mean, they're the far outlier, but no. And I certainly, in thinking, like, I've looked for polling and never really seen it, but like, how does Tim Scott do with black voters? Like, my suspicion is not all that well.
Yeah, I don't know that he does. I think like a couple points maybe, but it's not a big move the needle type thing.
Right. Yeah. So I was thinking more in terms of moderates where you might be swayed by.
I think he does have more effect on bringing in your moderate, again, your suburban women type voters.
Yeah.
Than he would. And again, not that it, I think he doesn't hurt you really, but just to say that you will, you'll pull in and especially if you're talking about a vice presidential candidate, right?
Mm-hmm.
How, I don't know. I mean, you probably, and Mike have probably better numbers on that as far as how much does the vice presidential choice move certain groups.
Not
and I
much.
think maybe you always get some, but to me, it's almost more of a, not that you're pulling more people in, but you're just keeping them in.
Right. Yeah. I think, as far as research goes, I mean, one thing that's just a nightmare in doing research on campaigns is, you've got real data problems. You've got a million things happening at once and not really all that many cases, and we can't really experimentally manipulate vice presidential choices. we can't run three separate worlds where, Trump picks all three of these
Right. You
and
can't,
see how it shakes out.
you can't control for X factor and say this was because of that, because everybody makes
to
up
use
their
technical
minds.
political science language, you can't control for Jack when it comes to studying elections, So, but that said, I mean, the conventional wisdom was often about, geographic balance. And I have seen some stuff that indicates that that's pretty much bunk,
I think it is these
been
days
a thing.
Although I think there might be something to a
that might be an 1840s story or something.
Right. But also maybe there might be sort of a urban rural, which isn't really geographic. It's not state by state, but it's just a
but I don't even know if that's in play. I mean, at this point, I mean, speaking as somebody,
because Trump seems to get the rural voters regardless.
Speaking as somebody who spends a fair amount of time so where I live, just for folks out there, is relatively urban. I mean, it's a metro of 120,000 people, but I spend a fair amount of time in rural places for idiosyncratic weird reasons. And boy, they love them some Trump out there. Which actually, as you're talking
real
about
America, as Mike and I call it,
as you're playing a country band at a bunch of county fairs, and you'll see real America. And so, but when you're talking about Burgum, I mean, I don't know that he needs to do that. In some ways, I don't know that brings anything there, because they're just all in for him already.
He's already got him. No, I think Burgum. I mean, I think the Burgum piece is more the energy thing.
The energy thing, yeah.
I think it's just the doesn't hurt, right?
Yeah, I've always been mystified. I mean, just going back, I mean, I've always anticipated a candidate sort of Trump-like in certain ways, but for it to be Trump has always sort of blown my mind. That this guy in the penthouse apartment is, suddenly the voice of, rural America,
the tribune of the people,
bikers and things like that.
Yeah.
It's for them to go all in. I mean, more power to him, but that's just not. I mean, did you expect this to be the leader of the populist revolt? I
in a way, not. Yes, actually.
In a way, okay, fair enough.
And the reason is that because Trump is not accepted into those circles, and he never has been.
True.
And that resonates, I think, with other people who feel that they are being cast out, looked down upon, not good enough, don't eat with the right fork or any fork, whatever, right?
But can you see sitting in a deer stand with him?
Actually, I probably could, right? I think, and also there's something in the idea of, and again, I'm probably wandering into dangerous stereotypes here, but I always think that, this is one of these, do people want to elect someone like themselves or someone different than themselves? And I think they want to elect a version of themselves that they think they could have been if they were more successful, right?
Kind of an aspirational thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And he sells that,
And it's sort of like if you look at this and you say, wow, look at this guy, this guy lives. He's, penthouse thing. He's married to models and,
gold toilet.
Gold toilet and affairs with porn stars maybe. And, all this, but he still eats at McDonald's.
Boy, you're really talking this up for me.
Pardon?
This sounded better and better by the minute.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if you're
an epiphany here,
you may say, look, this is, man, that's the life, right? He's got his own place in Florida and golf courses, and I think there is a piece of that resonates with a lot of people. I mean, I was sort of like, look, this is my weird, how strange I am, like personal fantasy, but it's sort of like I looked at I can remember the George Bush the Elder, right?
Right.
And it's sort of like, wow, that's sort of what I envisioned as. That sort of if I had only applied myself,
So you wanted to grow up to be a technocrat?
But the preppy New Englandy, went to all the right schools and ambassador and CIA director and all these things and well versed in meeting the that sort of thing, right? That appealed to me because that appealed to what would be best version of myself.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I don't know if there's any data at all to make this up, but I don't. Mike, I depend you on Mike for the data. But I do think there's something to that, right? That people look for a president and want to see the person that they would like to be if they were more, if they fulfilled their dreams, right?
Yeah, I so in terms of data that exactly speaks to that, I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't know, but a friend of mine in grad school actually wrote a dissertation that maybe touches on this a little bit in terms of identity and such. And, it maybe gets to some of that question of, why is there not more sort of class-based mobilization and things like that in American politics? But I remember from her project, I mean, one of the findings was that, a shocking number of people think that, hey, I could be paying millionaire taxes. I could be, there's this kind of, things could break right for me, and it was I don't remember the specifics. It's been, 20 years ago, but it was a shocking number of people who think, well, I could be part of the 1% someday. Right. So, that maybe kind of dovetails in with that. But so I wonder maybe if we shouldn't pivot. We had kind of one more topic to talk about. Boy, we're giving the people more than they bargained for today, I think. Yeah.
So, this one, the last story, probably won't have a whole lot to talk about. But on Wednesday, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez introduced articles of impeachment for Justices Alito and Thomas. She cited as the basis their repeated failure over decades to disclose gifts and business before the court, and also a refusal to recuse on certain cases. On the same vein, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a frequent Supreme Court critic, or at least critic of certain justices, has asked the DOJ, that's the Department of Justice that handles criminal matters, to investigate Justice Thomas over his various vacations and his affiliations with Harlan Crow and gifts he may have received as a part of his friendship with Mr. Crow. So to me, I find this is more than a little troubling. Mike and I talk a lot about attacks on the judiciary. And to me, this is kind of particularly pernicious in that, one, I think AOC just has her facts wrong, right? If there's cases that have to do with businesses that are before the courts, that's really a big deal. And I don't think that's the case. More to the point, I think the justices have reported what they were supposed to report under their reporting guidelines. Now, if you want to make the argument that those reporting guidelines ought to be stricter, and the Supreme Court did sort of introduce its own ethics canon last year after pressure, but they're the only ones who it's sort of self-enforced by its nature. Or if you want to make an argument, although I think it's a bad one, that Congress or someone else ought to have greater oversight into these sorts of issues, that's one thing. But I don't see the basis for impeachment here. And even more troubling is the White House, at least more troubling to me, right? Something conservatives have been complaining about for a long time, the criminalization of politics, of now we're calling for a special counsel to investigate Supreme Court justices. And again, with Clarence Thomas, which is really weird because in most cases, Clarence Thomas is a lone voice in the minority. So if people are trying to bribe him and paying off, they're really picking the wrong horse. But anyway, Justin, your thought, and also I throw this out because I was in a position not too long ago, going through some of the Ohio's judicial and lawyer canons of ethics, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things it mentions about judges is that, look, judges aren't always free to defend themselves, and as a lawyer, it is incumbent upon members of the bar to step up and seek to defend judges from unfair criticism. That's not to say that they should be afraid to move forward with fair criticism or allegations of impropriety where there's a real factual basis. But I think that's important, and I think it's troubling that this, we're going to run against the court. It's not a good look, and I think, again, for folks who are concerned about democracy broadly writ, I think this is a a bad way to go. But your thoughts?
Ooh, I'm all over the place. Yeah, I got thoughts. So I think a couple things. I've got in part some agreement, and I think some things I disagree with fairly strongly. I think the AOC thing. I'm pretty tired in general of sort of performative impeachment stuff.
Yeah, just to be clear, there have not been that many co-sponsors, and clearly it's not going to have the votes to go anywhere. But
Republicans have been doing this for years, and it's if you don't have anywhere near the votes, for God's sake, like just knock it off. I do think your point is an interesting one. Yeah, if you're going to apply pressure somewhere, buy John Roberts a motorhome is better. I don't know how he feels about motorhomes. That's your better investment. I don't know. I'm inclined to think, personally, this is a bigger deal. Although I'm not sure what the issue is here exactly. What the solution is. If you compare other kind of the ethics that other judges are bound to, this kind of gift giving, I think, is pretty troubling. And it doesn't look like Thomas initially declared everything. I mean, it kind of has trickled out, over the years. But sort of my connection to this, my dad's a retired judge from Illinois, and
Harlan Crow hardly ever takes him anywhere. Yeah,
hardly takes him anywhere, for God's sake, if he'd kick in for my tuition or what have you. But retired trial judge, not that exciting for Harlan Crow, I guess. But Illinois had a giant issue in the 80s with judicial corruption, and then kind of subsequent to that, a ton of new ethics standards and things like that. And my dad, who was a Republican, I'm not sure what he calls himself now, but he's been blowing a gasket over this. Basically, he was pretty by the book in terms of disclosure, and
yeah. Oh, I would agree with you 100%. It's a bad.
If you got $50 from somebody, it was you had to disclose it. And look, I don't think Thomas has got his ideology. I don't think that, is there payback to keep him happy? I mean, that's certainly one, liberal theory here is that, this is to keep Thomas from retiring, and whether that's bullshit or not, I don't know. But, you don't need to change Thomas's mind. I mean, you're absolutely right. He's got his own. God, is he the right of Scalia? He might be. He's.
Well, it's not. I would say not even necessarily. I think sort of he is, but I'm not even sure if you call it right or left. Right? It's just a different.
Yeah, it's basically
because keep in mind, Thomas wrote
repeal the New Deal forward.
Thomas wrote. Oh gosh, what was it? That was sort of really stunning. That was like a big pro-administrative state kind of opinion, and now I'm blanking on it. Just recently, but this was one of, everyone was like, wait, what?
Right.
It'll come back to me.
Those out of justices sometimes, right? It's out of character. But I do think, I think impeachment here, just as a numbers thing, and this is back to me being Machiavellian. I'm just going to lean into that today. But it's not worth it, if you don't have the numbers. And I think we've got a systemic failure on some level. And I've mentioned this on here before, in regards to other things. In a system with two parties, basically using impeachment is damn near impossible. But
it's a good fundraising tool.
It is a good fundraising tool. And, but I do think, the ability to sanction, that's part of checks and balances.
Yeah. And so I think we agree on more than you think we do. In that one, I think this is a bad look, and it frustrates me a little bit that I would think Justice Thomas, who ought to know better, right?
Right, absolutely,
would sort of mar his, I don't know if legacy is the right word yet, but it's almost make himself less effective because of this. I just think it tends to look sort of unseemly, even though I don't necessarily think there's any quid pro quo or anything like that. I just think this is sort of a small R Republican piece, right? That
sure.
Public servants shouldn't be kind of living as grandees, right? And maybe that's unfair to Thomas, but
For somebody to take me to Bali again.
Exactly. But yeah, Harlan, look, I do a hell of a lot for the cause. I'm on here every Saturday morning, and
Yeah,
I got zip.
Bali's nice this time of year, I hear.
Yeah. So, I think that bothers me, that it looks bad. The other thing, though, that I think, and you mentioned your dad as a state court judge and even other federal judges, there is a system, right? And it's enforced either by the state Supreme Court. I suppose in some states, the legislature has a stronger hand in that than others, or in the federal system, it's the U.S. Supreme Court. The problem arises that when you get to the Supreme Court,
right,
what do you do? Because either they're supreme or they're not. And the trade-off I think you tend to see is, well, the trade-off we have right now is that, look, we have a Supreme Court that is independent of the other political branches. The downside is, as far as accountability goes, that means that Supreme Court gets to make its own rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is something, I don't know where you fit this in exactly. I mean, on the one hand, the independence of the branches is important. I think the independence of the judiciary is important. But in a checks and balances kind of sense, I mean, the branches do have checks over each other, and there's this question, right, if the Supreme Court is supreme, who's going to enforce on them? And nobody in the judicial world. But it seems like they need to sort of step up this ethics game in some capacity, and it seems like Roberts is kind of amenable to that, on some level. But
yeah.
I'm not sure that it's entirely inappropriate for the legislative branch, setting aside any particular case. I mean, I'm not sure that it's inappropriate for them to want to, exercise some check over the judiciary. I mean, they're not going to police themselves, and ultimately we've got a system that's set up where each branch is supposed to police each other to some extent.
But to some extent, though, they do police themselves, right? I mean, there are still certainly recusals.
Sure,
and there's sort of a typical standard of recusal where the one that comes up most often is, for example, Elena Kagan, who was with the U.S. Solicitor's Office. If she'd worked on cases before in that office, she can't, as an advocate, she can't
right.
then hear them as a judge. That tends to be the most frequent. But also, and anytime you file a case in federal court, you have to file what's called this sort of disclosure of corporate affiliates. And you have to say, look, is this client party a publicly traded corporation? If so, what are the subsidiaries and all this stuff? And the idea being that, judges with that information then can make decisions, and they'll know if they are, perhaps conflicted, if they have an interest, hold stock in that company. So there is that system, and I think by and large it works. The problem is one, there's a lot of cases, a lot of disclosures, and sometimes things fall through the gaps. The Wall Street Journal did reporting on this a couple of years ago, where they found out there were a bunch of federal judges that turned out probably did have conflicts, right, based on what they owned and what was in there. But either they just they missed it, they didn't see the thing, and I get it, because it's sort of, for people who have vast stock and equity holdings like myself, to keep track on any given day, right, of what you own where. Now, and look, if you're doing this in mutual funds through your 401k, it's not an issue. It's just right. Owning direct stock. But so I'm sort of kidding around. But
well, that feels a lot like the congressional stock trading
today
story as well.
What you own, or it's a joint account with your wife, and Jesus, we just went over the thing with the flag, and I'm not going to bug her about what's in the investment account now. You know what I mean? So and this reporting showed up. There were a lot of things, and a lot of them were, it seemed to be honest mistakes, or just they just missed it. There were a handful of judges, though, that
egregious.
It was sort of like this curve of like this big slope of, there's sort of a gradual bump of folks, and this big spike of, there are a couple people who had, many of these issues, which would indicate it's not just an occasional miss, but that there was, maybe intentional ignorance of what they were doing. But the concern that I would have, right, if I'm a judge or a justice, is the reporting requirement in and of itself can be easily weaponized, right? And to me, it's a fool's game, right? If you report something, then it's going to be the aha, look at this, look at everything this guy's taken, he's therefore corrupt. If you don't report it, it's like aha, look what they're hiding. And I think that would be the issue. I think just the reporting, extending the reporting requirement, puts the court in a difficult position, because that information can kind of be twisted pretty easily. That said, again, I go back to my other point is like, well, don't be stupid.
Right.
There's a often, saying in the law that, and elsewhere, I think, probably in Iowa, that, pigs survive, hogs get slaughtered. So it's, you can, and I think that's sort of, good advice, but.
All right. Well, should we perhaps call it a
We
day
should
for
actually.
this one?
Probably over time. I haven't even looked at the time.
Oh, we're over by a bunch. So
Gosh. Well, you can edit judiciously. Mike can
leave it to Mike.
Yeah. So, well, Justin, this has been a ball doing it. I always get a kick out of doing the show with you, and we would encourage folks to stick around for our bonus show, which we will discuss. For example, speaking of, it's not quite impeachment, but contempt of Congress vote by the Republicans to hold Attorney General Garland in Congress. We'll talk about the IRS, and we'll talk about the Project 2025, which is put in. We'd like to thank all our executive producers, and I apologize for not naming everyone, because if I missed one, then I would feel bad. But you know who you are, and we couldn't do this without you. So, Justin, it's been fun, and I look forward to talking to you on the bonus show.
That's been a pleasure. We'll see you again soon.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,